Hello, my name is Diane Hall. I am the Collections Manager here at the Auburn-Cord-Duesenberg Automobile Museum. Thank you for listening to this presentation on the Chicago Taxi War. Most of you have likely never heard of the Taxi War before. There were, in fact, several taxi wars. The one we will discuss today was one of the largest and took place in the 1920s between the Yellow Cab Company and the Checkered Cab Company in Chicago. The Chicago Taxi War included multiple shootings, cabs being used as tanks, and likely police corruption, and much more. However, reliable documentation on the war is somewhat difficult to come by. As I conducted research for this presentation, I found that newspapers were often the best source for tracing this rivalry, but there are many gaps in the story, as you will see. Before we discuss the war, we need to have some understanding of the history and relationship of the two companies and what was going on in the country and in Chicago in the first part of the 20th century. First, it's important to note that the history of each of these companies and their relationship to each other is complicated. This history involves a very complex set of business relationships. Here you will see just a few of the various companies related to both Yellow and Checker that played a part in this story. I have done my best to streamline the history for this presentation, but if you choose to do more research after this presentation, just know you will be going down quite the wormhole. Aside from the complex histories of the companies, we also have to remember that nothing takes place in a vacuum. There was a lot going on in the early 20th century. What were some of the social and historical events taking place around this time? Take a few moments to think about this. 1900 to 1930 was a complicated and fascinating time. There were issues with immigration. From 1900 to 1915, more than 15 million immigrants arrived in the United States. Then, the Immigration Act of 1917 established a literacy requirement for immigrants entering the country and halted immigration from most Asian countries. World War I raged from 1914 to 1918, and it was a time of very little government regulation for most industries. As President Calvin Coolidge said, "The business of America is business." This really sums up the philosophy of the era. Organized crime was common, often taking the form of street gangs. It was not unusual for businesses to utilize them for various purposes. Of course, with Prohibition, you had the rise of moonshiners and groups like Al Capone's Chicago Gang. The women's suffrage movement was taking place at this time, as well as the first Great Migration, where there was an exodus of African Americans from the South to the North. And of course, the start of the Great Depression. These topics and much more were all intertwined with each other. After this presentation, take some time to think about what a list like this would look like for the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Secondly, we have to understand that wars between companies and within companies were not uncommon during this time. When we say war, we are talking about violent confrontations between at least 2 factions that typically spanned years. Here are a few examples. The kosher meat war. This started when beef companies increased the price of kosher meats. Many of the Jewish women in New York, often recent immigrants with little to no education, took matters into their own hands. To quote this article from the New York Herald, dated May 18, 1902, "Many leading or carrying children, they destroyed the meat of several kosher shops, smashed windows, assaulted men and women, took their meat away from them and threw it in the street, and made a number of butchers close up after they had driven them from their shops." There was the West Virginian Coal Wars, which were a series of conflicts between West Virginian mine workers and coal companies. This included shootouts between miners and their agents hired by the coal companies. In one case, when 2 supporters of the miners, including the chief of police, arrived at court, unarmed, to stand trial for allegedly destroying property belonging to one of the coal companies, they were shot and killed. The railroad wars happened in different places around the country at different times. In one conflict in 1908 between railroad owners Edward Harriman and James J. Hill, their competing construction crews would blow up the other side's supplies, dumped boulders into their camps, and there were several gunfights. The Colorado Labor Wars were a series of strikes by miners and mill workers in 1903 and 1904 that was met with a military response by the Colorado National Guard, militia groups, and private detective agencies. Finally, there was the Chicago Circulation War that occurred roughly between 1900 and 1914. On one side was William Randolph Hearst's and his Chicago Evening American, and on the other was Robert R. McCormick and the Chicago Tribune. This rivalry led to daily battles between what were essentially professional gangs. One fight involved 60 armed men. There were at least 20 deaths attributed to the conflict. No newspaper in the city made any report about these altercations. Finally, since the events we are talking about occurred in Chicago, we should take a moment to think about what was happening in the city in the early 1900s. There were around 16 cab companies operating in the city. At this time, cabs were often connected with private clubs, hotels, restaurants, or other organizations. Competition for business was fierce. The immigration population was rapidly growing, with more than 2 million immigrants having arrived in the city. The Black Hand, an Italian extortion racket, was highly active. Typical Black Hand tactics involved sending a letter to a victim and threatening bodily harm, kidnapping, arson, or murder if a ransom was not paid. The letter sent demanded a specific amount of money to be delivered to a specific place. Reagan's Colts, an Irish street gang with white supremacist undertones, was very active and connected to many of the events that took place in Chicago around this time, including the Chicago race riot of 1919, caused by a white man assaulting an African American teenager at a beach. The resulting casualties included 38 fatalities, 527 injured, and 1,000 black families left homeless. Into this fray came immigrant Sander Herz. Herz was born in Slovakia, at the time Austria-Hungary, in 1879 to a Jewish family. He and his family immigrated in 1882, arriving in Chicago in 1884. Herz attended school until about the age of 11, when he left to begin working. Through his early years, he had several different jobs. As a young man, he boxed for a time under the Irish name Dan Donnelly, because he feared his Jewish surname might attract attention of anti-Semites. He got out of boxing only because his fiancée refused to marry him otherwise. In 1904, he began working as a salesman at an automobile dealership. By the next year, he was the sales manager at a competing dealership. In 1907, he teamed up with one Walden W. Shaw of the Shaw Company, a manufacturer of automobiles. They decided to turn a fleet of trade-in vehicles into taxicabs for private clubs. By 1915, Herz and Shaw were operating the Yellow Cab Company, and by 1920, there was virtually no competition for Yellow Cab in Chicago aside from Checkered Cab. Notice in one of these advertisements, they boast about having no labor wars. At some point, Herz changed his name to John Daniel Hertz. Hertz had a great skill in making what we might call business arrangements behind the scenes that were highly advantageous to his company. One factor in Yellow's success was Hertz's friendship with Chicago Mayor William H. Thompson. We will look at that further in a few slides. The history of Checkered Cab also involves the story of an immigrant. Morris Markin was born in Russia in 1893, and like Hertz, he was born into a Jewish family and worked many jobs in his youth. Legend has it that when he came to the United States at the age of 19, he had to borrow money from a janitor at Ellis Island to pay the entry fee. He worked in the garment business, eventually accumulating enough earnings to finance the immigration of his immediate family to the United States, where he found them positions in Chicago's growing garment industry. He initially made his first significant earnings by making uniforms for the Army during World War I. Markin then began investing in businesses owned by other Russian immigrants. He loaned a large sum of money to the Lomberg Auto Body Manufacturing Company. The owner defaulted on the payments, leading to Markin taking ownership in 1920 and renaming it the Markin Body Company. Around the same time, the Commonwealth Motor Corporation, a manufacturing company, went into bankruptcy, and Markin acquired the assets. A few months later, Markin merged the two firms and he reorganized them as the Checkered Cab Manufacturing Company. However, Markin was not the founder of Checkered Taxi. Rather, Markin would slowly acquire Checkered Taxi of Chicago over the course of the 1920s. The Checkered Taxi Company was founded in 1919 by an Oak Park, Illinois cabbie. It was also probably the first taxi company in the United States to hire African American drivers. By the mid-1920s, Checkered's operations were overseen by Michael M. Sokol, described as a competent, streetwise manager. Reliable information on Mr. Sokol is thin. He was likely an Eastern European or Russian immigrant brought to the United States as an infant. Given the time period, being considered a streetwise manager says a lot, and we can draw a few educated guesses about the kind of person he was. Now that the stage is set, we can ask the major question: what caused this war? Given what we have talked about up to this point, take a few moments to think about this question. What do you think is the most likely answer? The actual answer is surprisingly difficult to pin down. Here is what an article from the Journal of Law and Economics says about the cause of the war. The causes are difficult to unravel from the conflicting claims and charges reported in the contemporary press. The conflict appears to have been between Yellow on the one hand and Checker and the smaller companies on the other. Drivers, or more likely hired killers for each group, attempted, and upon occasion succeeded, in killing the drivers for the other. But even if we cannot ascertain the exact cause of the war, surely we should be able to pinpoint when the war started, right? While we are helped in this in that Checker Cab only started in 1919, this is also a surprisingly difficult question to answer. Conflict between cab companies was very common, so it's hard to say when the term taxi war began being used. This article from July 7, 1919 from the Chicago Tribune shows that altercation between cab companies had been happening for some time. Here, 3 yellow cab drivers were arrested for assaulting the drivers of the LaSalle Taxi Cab Company. All that being said, there was one specific issue that caused a lot of tension between Yellow and Checker, and seems to have contributed the most to the rise in violence between them. That issue was permits to use city cab stands. Access to city cab stands was critical to the success of any cab company. If a cab company couldn't access these stands, it would have a huge effect on their business. One of the very first moves in what would become the war between Yellow and Checker was made by Hertz. In 1920, he began some behind-the-scenes political maneuvering. As I mentioned earlier, this was something he was very good at. This is where Hertz's friendship with Mayor William H. Thompson, pictured here, comes into play. Thompson approved changes to the 1895 cab stand ordinance. Cab drivers were now required to obtain a city permit before they could operate out of municipal cab stands. While all of the yellow cab drivers were able to easily obtain permits, the checkered drivers were much more often than not denied permits. The first reported major violent conflict between Yellow and Checker seems to have happened in July 1920, with this article running in the newspapers. The altercation started as a fistfight between 2 drivers, possibly over positions in a cab stand line at a movie theater. Exactly how it snowballed into the wide-reaching street brawl is unclear. But it grew for hours and included multiple drive-by shootings and yellow cabs shooting at the checkered cab headquarters. Let me read a few lines from this article. After the yellow cabs shot at the checkered headquarters, this article reads, rallying, the black and white checkered cabs of the attacked concern dashed out in mass and ripped into the yellow for counterattacks according to the best tactics of shock action. Then, at the very end of the article, as far as police could learn, there were no casualties. 3 people were arrested. But this was not the only consequence from this event. The very next night, a checkered driver would lose his life. Anthony Sugar, a 21-year-old driver for Checker, was shot by a yellow cab driver. In reports about this incident, you can see conflicting information about the cause of the taxi war. In the first article, it states that the trouble started when 50 cabs jockeyed for position in line before a Loop Theater. This is a reference to the article we saw before. In one other article, we see an alternative explanation for the conflict between the two companies aside from cab stands. It says, the trouble is said to be caused by the differences in rates and the fact that drivers from one company are non-union. So now what we have been able to establish is that while there were 2 violent confrontations between Yellow and Checker, there had been conflict even before this. And the exact cause of that conflict is somewhat unclear, but likely the result of multiple factors. Mayor Thompson, being a politician and wanting to get reelected, knew he couldn't have the 2 largest cab companies in the city having open war on the street. If you were him, what would you do? Mayor Thompson essentially fired the chief of police and appointed a new chief. The person he appointed was one Mr. Charles G. Fitzmaurice. Who was Charles Fitzmaurice? He was Thompson's secretary. Despite what may have been nepotism, it seems that at least at first, Fitzmaurice was having a positive impact on Chicago. One Chicago woman commented in the Chicago Tribune in December that, quote, pretty soon it will be safe to wear our diamonds and patronize taxis without an escort. Fitzmaurice was chief of police from 1920 to 1923, and just as a fun fact, he was born in Fort Wayne. Thus, the taxi war entered 1921. Another shooting took place in February of 1921. It was reported that more than 50 shots were fired between rival cab drivers after drivers from one company, in quote, mass formation, entered the garage of another cab company. 2 people were arrested. Interestingly, Yellow Cab began using the taxi war in their advertisement in March of that year. This ad attempts to place Yellow in a very positive light. It says, quote, there cannot be a war unless 2 sides are fighting. This is an interesting stance, given, if you remember, that in July of 1920, Yellow Cab was reported as having shot up the checkered cab headquarters, and in August, drivers of Yellow Cab killed Anthony Sugar, a checkered driver. This advertisement claims that there was no revival in the taxi cab war. This is a claim that will be made several more times by different parties, that there is no revival in the war. This makes the exact start and end date of the taxi war that much more unclear. That same month, 3 officials and 7 stockholders from Checkered Cab were indicted by a grand jury, including that streetwise checkered manager, Michael Sokol. The charges were, quote, conspiracy to violate a municipal ordinance and of defrauding the city of certain licensing taxes. This is likely a reference to the permit fees. Once again, we see this issue of permits being central to the conflict. Things had gotten bad enough that the state's attorney began investigating the taxi war, stating, quote, I am going to stop, if this office can, a reign of terror being inaugurated in the city by any company, association, or organization, the throwing of bombs, smashing of windows, bombings of homes and businesses, and the slugging and shooting of citizens. Officials of both companies said they were willing to cooperate with the investigation in every way. and each made statements in the press. Hertz stated, quote, "Certain other cab companies now operating apparently are jealous of our business, of the public's goodwill and belief in us that brings us this business. They seek, through intimidation of our drivers, to keep us away from the desirable stands for our cabs. As the president of the Yellow Cab Company, I welcome this inquiry." A representative for Checker stated, quote, "In July 1920, we made our first appearance in the Loop. Then our competitors immediately took the offensive and opened warfare, blocking our stands, wrecking our cabs, and beating up our drivers. We welcome any sort of investigation of our affairs." The result of the investigation was 1. Michael Sokol being held for perjury, and 2. Two other officials, along with those 7 stockholders, being indicted for conspiracy to violate a municipal ordinance and defrauding the city. You do have to wonder if Hertz's friendship with the mayor had any influence on these findings. More violence occurred on June 7th. A checkered driver struck a yellow cab driver on the head with a jack handle. The checkered driver was arrested, along with another driver, and interestingly, a yellow cab superintendent, under violating the Sadler Act. The Sadler Act limited the work hours of those under 18 years old. Police had to force cabs away from the location where the incident took place, the Hotel Sherman. Cabs would circle the block, come back, and police would have to chase them away again. It was the very next night that one of the most significant and violent events in the taxi war took place. Several skirmishes took place throughout the day, including a car accident, what was described as a minor shooting, and a vandalized cab. Allegedly, a checkered driver named Morris Steuben intentionally rear-ended a yellow cab. A fight broke out, and Steuben was hit on the head with a brick. Reporting this to Michael Sokol, a plan was made. 20-year-old Philip Fox, another checker driver, was called by Sokol to pick up Morris Steuben and 3 others at a checkered garage. Sokol wanted to get even with the yellow cab drivers for injuring Steuben. The 3 other men were enforcers provided by Sokol, probably connected to a local street gang. These 3 men were in the back of a Stutz touring car when Fox arrived. Sokol instructed Fox and Steuben to take these men to a neighborhood where many yellow cabs operated. It should be noted that the 3 men were concealed by curtains in the back of the Stutz. When they arrived in an area where yellow cabs operated, the 3 men began shooting at the yellow cabs, killing a driver named Thomas Skirvin. Witnesses later identified Fox and Steuben, and within hours they were arrested and had confessed. However, 2 days later, Fox recanted, claiming police had forced his confession by beating him. In an interesting and confusing twist, about a week later, at a City Council Local Transportation Committee meeting, a former yellow cab driver claimed that he had been sent out in a cab painted like a checkered cab for the purpose to, quote, "make trouble for the checkered cab people," and that he had been promised a good job if he helped put Checker out of business. Chief Fitzmaurice, responding to all this, he vowed to remove permits from any driver who was found fighting. Additionally, every taxicab operating in Chicago's business district was searched for weapons. We see discrepancies in the historical record with the number of people arrested for these murders. However, throughout most of the reports on the case, only 2 men are consistently named, Fox and Steuben. Perhaps it was Chief Fitzmaurice's threat to remove the permits from any cab driver caught fighting that led to what happened next. With 2 of their drivers accused of murder, the checkered cab company made a somewhat surprising move. They accused city officials, including the mayor, of conspiracy. Their accusations centered around the issuing, or for Checker, the refusal to be issued, cab stand permits. Through the rest of the year, there were several continuances in this conspiracy case, with no real developments one way or another. Ultimately, the city did start issuing permits to checkered cab. I should mention here that checkered cab was in and out of court a lot, which we will see throughout the next few slides. This brings us to 1922. Checker cabs started off the year in court, with a case attempting to remove them completely off the streets. This, of course, was ultimately unsuccessful, and Checker continued to operate. There was also a minor update in the Fox and Steuben trial, when their attorney sought to have their confessions thrown out under allegations that they had been coerced. These confessions were the main evidence for the prosecution in the murder trial, but they were ultimately barred by the judge, being found to have been coerced. The trial ended in a hung jury. However, this is not the last we will hear of Fox, Steuben, or this case. Overall, this was a pretty quiet year between the companies. This is likely the result of there being an increased police attention on the war. Remember, police were going so far as to search individual cabs for weapons, so it's not surprising that incidences, or at least reported ones, were less frequent. I also wanted to mention here that both companies were expanding, often into the same cities, and the war between them followed. Throughout newspapers, conflict between the two companies and each city they both existed in continued. Just because violent incidences, or again, reported ones, were less frequent, did not mean that Yellow and Checker did not have other ways of continuing their rivalry. Yellow started 1923 by seeking an injunction against Checker over a shutter panel design. Likely unrelated to this copyright case, in April, a checkered cab driver fired on a Yellow superintendent. A policeman intervened, with the checkered cab firing on the policeman. The very next month, Morris Markin was charged with stock fraud. He was accused of violating what is known as the Blue Sky Law, which regulates the sales of securities, or tradable financial assets, in order to protect the public from fraud. You may have noticed at this point that Checker officials seem to end up in court a lot more than Yellow officials. It's not that Hertz and Yellow were not doing the same things as Markin and Checker, but rather, Hertz was far more skilled at conducting such business behind the scenes. We'll see more about that in a few slides. Things took a strange turn in June of that year. A conflict broke out between pro and anti-union factions at Checker. A union organizer named Frank Sexton was killed by those opposed to unionization. To quote one of the newspapers at the time, he was shot to death in a duel with two checkered taxi drivers. The two men were believed to be Max Rafeman and John Rose. They would claim that Sexton opened fire on them first. This shooting took place almost right before Morris Markin's home was bombed, most likely the result of this internal conflict, rather than the rivalry with Yellow. This would lead to him relocating both himself, his family, as well as his business headquarters to Michigan. The internal conflict at Checker between pro and anti-union factions would, in a certain sense, become the dominant conflict in the Chicago taxicab industry for a time, and overshadow the rivalry between Checker and Yellow. In October of 1923, the president of Checkered Cab was lured out of his house by two men dressed as police officers and beaten. The only motivation that was posited was that he was a witness for the defense in the trial of Rafeman and Rose, who were accused of killing Frank Sexton. And, as was becoming a somewhat common occurrence, Morris Markin found himself in court, along with another high-ranking Checker official, on accusations of perjury and bribery. Markin was released on a $10,000 bail, the equivalent of about $160,000 today. The charges stemmed from three Checker drivers who had originally signed affidavits supporting Yellow Cab. All later claimed that the affidavits had been forged, only to then on the stand say that each had been offered $5,000 by Markin to change their story. The exact end of the taxi war between Checker and Yellow is as difficult to pinpoint as was the start. While it certainly was not over at this point, we do see just a few violent incidences between the two companies over the next several years. 1924 was a pretty quiet year in the war between Yellow and Checker, but the internal conflict at Checker between the Union and non-Union factions continued. In one case, a death resulted from what was called a, quote, revolver battle in a cab company's general office. There were also several run-ins between the Yellow Cab Company and the Deluxe Cab Company. In April 1924, Morris Markin was found guilty for violating the Blue Sky Laws, which he had been accused of in 1923. He was sentenced to 30 days in jail and a $2,000 fine, which would be roughly $30,000 today. You will recall that in June of 1923, a union organizer named Frank Sexton was murdered, and that checkered cab drivers Max Raifman and John Rose were arrested for his murder. What happened to them? Well, John Rose was shot by Patrick Sexton, the father of Frank Sexton, before the trial concluded. Rose was shot as he was leaving the court after his defense had asked for a continuance. Raifman was eventually acquitted of all charges after witnesses for both the defense and the prosecution testified that Frank Sexton had shot first. Patrick Sexton, Frank's father, would be tried for the murder of John Rose. He would claim self-defense and was eventually acquitted of all charges in 1925. Morris Markin and the other Checker official who had been accused of perjury the previous year were also acquitted. For a variety of reasons, including that a man named Jack Cherbow, who was twice indicted for murder in connection to the Taxi War, was found murdered in a Chicago suburb, the Chicago police decided to increase their ranks. A special detective squad was formed with more than 60 police officers. What did this special detective squad do? Here is a description from a newspaper article at the time. They, quote, set out at dusk under orders to visit every questionable cafe, store, and house in the city, arresting whomsoever they suspect of being connected with recent robberies or shootings. The squads were not assigned to special territories, but allowed to tour the city at will. I want to take a moment to touch on something I have mentioned a few times now, that John Hertz of Yellow Cab was very good at operating behind the scenes. As you've seen, Morris Markin was in and out of court, while Hertz was not. I want to give you an example of Hertz's behind-the-scene behavior, so let's take a look at his friendship with this man. Take a moment to see if you recognize him. This is Joseph P. Kennedy, father of future President John F. Kennedy. In 1924, Hertz and Kennedy became friends, and Kennedy would ultimately help Hertz manipulate the stock prices of Yellow Cab. The first few months of 1925 continued to be fairly quiet, at least very little was reported in the newspapers. And then a bomb was thrown into a taxi. The driver had been called to an address. He got out of the cab to knock on the door when the bomb was thrown into his cab. A passerby grabbed the bomb and threw it into the street. This was probably the result of the ongoing conflict at Checker between the pro and anti-union factions, but no one knows for sure. Additionally, our old friends, Philip Fox and Morbus Steuben, were retried after the hung jury at their first trial. They were found guilty and given a life sentence. However, this is still not the last we will hear about them and their case. In September of that same year, another shooting took place between several cabs. Though interestingly, the newspaper articles at the time do not say which companies took part in the shooting. The city of Chicago for several years had taken a strict stand on cab drivers carrying weapons. And in news that's probably not very surprising, some Checker employees were fined after being found carrying guns, including Max Raifman, the man who had been acquitted of the murder of Frank Sexton. At this time, the Yellow Cab Company was owned by the Chicago Yellow Cab Company, which in turn was owned by Hertz and some other investors. Hertz sold the Yellow Cab Manufacturing Company to General Motors, who merged it with their truck manufacturing operation and reorganized them as the Yellow Truck and Coach Corporation. Although its corporate headquarters remained in Chicago, all manufacturing was subsequently relocated to Michigan. The sale to General Motors did not involve the Chicago Yellow Cab Company or the Yellow Taxi Corporation of New York, two totally separate firms controlled by Hertz that operated taxicabs in their respective communities. Another violent confrontation took place in December 1925 between a checkered cab, a yellow cab, and a black and white cab. The yellow and the black and white maneuvered their cabs to block a checkered cab from picking up a fare. The checker, undeterred, drove right into the two other cabs. It then became a scene similar to the very first headline we saw with cabs being used as tanks. That same month, our old friends Morris Steuben and Philip Fox attempted to get their life sentences overturned, but lost. Once again, this is not the last we will hear about them or their case. In 1926, a man named Robert Stame was charged with murdering a man named Howard Berkowitz. Not much is known about Stame. In one newspaper article, he was referred to as a, quote, notorious police character. And in fact, in 1924, he had been shot with 5 bullets over a gambling dispute. He was a key witness in the Steuben and Fox case. Berkowitz was a checkered cab driver, like Steuben and Fox. Stame claimed that he had been threatened for testifying in the case. The jury was unable to reach a verdict on Stame's guilt or innocence. As I mentioned, the exact start and end of the taxi war is difficult to pinpoint. This headline shows there was a great fear of the renewal of the taxi war, though from all of the articles we have looked at, I can't say that the taxi war ever ended. Also, a note about 1926. This is a year that John D. Hertz sold his car rental company, then called the Drive Yourself System. He had acquired this just 3 years prior in 1923. Can you guess what the rental business is called today? Hertz. It appears that 1927 was another quiet year between Yellow and Checker. At least, not much was reported in the newspapers. But there were some goings-on at Checkered Cab, with their pro- and anti-union factions. As seen in this article stating that for safety, 10 police officers attended the election of new directors for the company. It appears that the internal conflict at Checker was not completely over yet. Additionally, Robert Stame pleaded guilty to manslaughter in the death of Howard Berkowitz instead of going back to trial after his first trial ended in a hung jury. It was in September 1928 that a yellow cab driver was arrested for shooting a checkered cab driver. Given how quiet it had been up to this point between the two companies, it is perhaps not surprising that this led to the following headlines. While several sources had reported a fear of a, quote, renewal of the taxi war, we might say that this incident officially reignited the war between Checker and Yellow that had, to some extent, lulled for a few years. About a week after the shooting, 2 yellow cab garages were bombed. From one article, it states, quote, only a few employees were in the building when the dynamite was placed in the rear entrance, exploded, and none of them were seriously hurt. And the vice president of Yellow Cab Company immediately issued a statement denying the report that the bombing indicated a renewal in the taxicab war which swept Chicago 4 years ago. haven't any idea of the reason for these bombings. We have no labor troubles, and there's no reason to suspect business rivals. 10 men suspected of having part in the bombings were arrested at an apartment. They were found with a machine gun, 6 pistols, 2 shotguns, and what was called a large quantity of ammunition. As a result, police details were assigned to every cab stand and taxi garage in the city. A few days later, 8 of the men that had been arrested were released, as there was no evidence to hold them. Checker was not done with their revenge. Hertz and his wife owned a number of racehorses, including a Kentucky Derby winner. Their stable was set on fire around 8 p.m. on October 1, 1928. In an article published the next day, it stated, Mr. Hertz and his superintendent asserted they had no suspicions concerning the origin of the fire, but investigators said that the barn was much nearer fireproof than such structures usually are. There was no logical way to explain the outbreak of the fire. 11 horses died, some were saved, including the Derby winner. A representative of Checker denied Checker Cab was involved, and then demanded that an investigation be done into, quote, favoritism of yellow cab companies in the matter of loop parking places. The state's attorney ordered all checkered business records be seized. He also made a public statement vowing to get to the bottom of the stable fire and the rivalry between Yellow and Checker. In response, Checker's lawyers issued a public letter accusing the authorities of caring more about a stable burning than the murder of one of their drivers. Just days later, a judge ordered the state's attorney to return the checkered records. However, this led to yet another potential crime to be investigated. Checker's attorneys accused the city of misappropriating $6,000 paid in 1926 as the checkered company's public stand licensing fees, but that the licenses had never been issued. So now there is murder, arson, and possible embezzlement. Just as Yellow Cab had used the taxi wars in their advertisement a few years prior, Checker began using this complicated legal mess in their own advertising. This advertisement, printed on October 9, 1928, in the Chicago Tribune, demanded a, quote, square deal from the Chicago city government. This same year, Hertz had grown tired dealing with all of this and was ready to get out of this messy taxi cab business. If you were Hertz, who would you consider selling your cab company to? How about Morris Markin? The plan for the sale was, like all things in this history of Checker and Yellow, complicated. To quote one source, it involved a carefully planned sequence of events whereby the minority shareholders wouldn't be alerted to the ultimate goal of the transaction until after it had occurred, thereby keeping the value of the various shares as stable as possible. This would involve multiple parties. The very first of these carefully planned sequence of events took place in 1929. It was also in 1929 that the final conclusion to the Steuben and Fox trial occurred. They appealed their convictions and life sentences and won. You might call this the official end of the taxi war. So, where does this leave us with Yellow and Checker? Morris Markin, with the help of his family, controlled both companies until his death in July 1970, along with a variety of other companies. This chart from 1946 will give you an idea of how all of these companies were connected with each other and the complicated relationships between them. He was also able to maintain control for so long, in part because of help from a friend of his. In 1933, the board of directors tried to force Markin out, voting to remove him as president. What the board didn't know was that Markin had a friend, and his name was E.L. Cord. Markin signed over a controlling share of stocks to Cord. Cord reinstated Markin as president, and placed 2 trusted associates on the board of directors, allowing Markin to maintain control until the end of his life. Today, you can see this 1933 checkered cab in our Out of Quarantine exhibit on the first floor of the museum. It is a testament to the colorful history of the checkered cab company. Thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it and will be able to visit us at the museum soon. Please follow us on Facebook to learn about all of our upcoming events.